You ever even drawn a motorcycle before?
I drew that one hundreds of times. I just never saw it finished.
80 bikers, one memorial ride, and a starving young woman carrying a cardboard sign. She walked into that parking lot with charcoal on her hands and a sketchbook held together with tape. The sign read, "Bike sketches. Pay whatever you think it's worth." They laughed. One biker asked whether she had ever even drawn a motorcycle, but she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the black Harley parked in the center of the lot, the motorcycle no one was allowed to touch. Then she said 7 words that silenced every man there. "I drew that one hundreds of times." She took one step closer. "I just never saw it finished." 79 bikers had no idea what she meant. One man did, and he was already reaching for his keys. Before we go any further, I want to know something. Because in about 40 minutes, 80 men are going to stand in a circle around that girl. And every one of them rode in from somewhere different. Different counties, different states, different lives. They only had one thing in common, and it wasn't the leather. So tell me where you're riding in from today. Drop your town, your state, your country in the comments right now. Texas, Ohio, Scotland, wherever you're sitting. I read every single one, and I want to see how big this circle gets. And while you're down there, subscribe. Because this story does not go where you think it goes. Now, let me take you back to that parking lot. It was the 3rd Saturday in October, on a stretch of Highway 62 that runs past a town too small to bother naming on most maps. There's a gas station with 2 pumps, one of which has been out of order since the Obama administration. There's a feed store. There's a bar with a gravel lot big enough for 100 motorcycles, which is not an accident, because for 31 years that gravel lot has been the closest thing the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club has to a church. They don't arrive all at once. That's the thing people get wrong about these men. In the movies, they come over the hill in a wall of noise, 100 headlights and a sound like the end of the world. It isn't like that. Not on this day. On this day, they come in 1s and 2s over the better part of 40 minutes. And each engine you hear on that highway is a man who got up before dawn in some other county and rode 4 hours to sit in a parking lot and not say very much. The first one that morning was there at 7:15, and he sat on his bike with the engine off and his hands on his knees for 20 minutes before anyone else came. Then 2 more. Then a cluster of 6 that had ridden up together from the state line. Then a single rider, older, slower, who took a long time getting his leg over the seat when he stopped. By 9 in the morning, there were 80 motorcycles in that lot, and the sound of them arriving had not been the sound of a gang. It had been the sound of a procession. The Iron Saints were founded 31 years ago by 4 men who worked at a foundry that doesn't exist anymore. 3 of them are still alive. The 4th is buried 90 minutes east of that parking lot, under a granite headstone that his brothers paid for. And if you go and stand in front of it, you will see something that a lot of people notice and almost nobody says out loud. The word carved biggest on that stone is brother. The word father is underneath it, and it's smaller. Every man in that club knows that was the wrong order. Not one of them said so at the time. That's going to matter. Hold on to it. And in the middle of that gravel lot, dead center, with the 80 other bikes arranged around it in a rough circle, the way iron filings arranged themselves around a magnet, there was a black Harley. It didn't ride in. It never does. It comes on a trailer, and 2 men lift it down, and they walk it into position by hand, and then they step back from it, like men stepping back from something that might still be warm. Nobody touches that bike. Nobody sits on it. There is a rule about this that has never been written down anywhere because it has never needed to be. Once a year, on the 3rd Saturday in October, that motorcycle is unloaded, and it sits in the center of the lot for the length of the gathering, and then at the end of the day it leads the ride, with 1 man on it, chosen by the president, riding a machine that isn't his. And the rest of the year it sits under a canvas sheet in a garage bay, finished, almost finished, because there is a place on that motorcycle. One specific place, and I'm not going to tell you where yet, that has been left bare for 5 years. Bare metal, unpainted. Every man in that club has looked at it 1,000 times and assumed it was just something Caleb never got around to. There is a reason that bike is unfinished in that one specific place. And in about 50 minutes, a 24-year-old girl with charcoal on her hands is going to walk across that gravel and notice it before any of them do. 3 blocks away, in the shade behind the feed store, there was a 1997 sedan with a cracked windshield and a back seat that held everything a person owned. That's not a figure of speech. That was the inventory. 2 garbage bags of clothes, a cardboard box with a coffee maker in it that she had no way to plug in, a framed photograph face down under the bags so it wouldn't get scratched, a blanket, a gallon jug of water, refilled at gas stations, 4 days old, and on the passenger seat, a sketchbook. Her name was Wren Halloway. She was 24 years old. She had $6.40, and she knew it was $6.40, because when you have $6.40, you know the exact number the way other people know their own phone number. She had 11 blank pages left in that sketchbook. She had counted them twice that week. She had not eaten anything since the day before yesterday, and she had stopped noticing that around noon the previous day, which is a thing that happens and which she would not have described to you as an emergency, because by that point in her life it was closer to weather. The sign was the back of a box. It's worth sitting with that for a second. The cardboard she wrote on, bike sketches, pay whatever you think it's worth. She cut that out of a box that used to hold her mother's medication. She'd kept the box for 11 months because it was sturdy and because throwing it away had felt like something. And on that Saturday morning, she cut it up with a pocket knife on the hood of the car and wrote on it with the same charcoal she drew with. And that is the entire story of how that sign came to exist. Now understand what she was doing there, because this is the part that changes how you watch everything that comes after. She was not there for the Iron Saints. She did not know it was a memorial ride. She did not know what the 3rd Saturday in October meant. She had been driving south on 62 looking for a truck stop with a bathroom she could wash up in, and she came around a bend, and she saw a gravel lot with what looked like 100 motorcycles in it. And the thought she had, the honest, hungry 24-year-old thought she had, sitting in that car with $6.40, was not "those are my father's people." The thought she had was, "that's 100 wallets." She sat there for a long time working up to it. She fixed her hair in the rearview mirror with her fingers, and she looked at her hands, and she scrubbed at the charcoal with a wet napkin and gave up, because it doesn't come off. It never comes off. It's in the creases and under the nails, and it is the permanent price of the only thing she was ever good at. Then she picked up the sign and the sketchbook, and she got out of the car. She was not begging. I want to be very clear about that, because it matters to her and it should matter to you. She was offering a trade. She had a skill, and she was going to stand in front of strangers and offer it, which is a harder thing to do than most people who have never been hungry will ever understand. She thought she'd found a payday. She had actually just walked into her own father's funeral. 5 years late, 80 men went quiet, not all at once. It moved through that lot the way a shadow moves across a field when a cloud goes over the sun. The men nearest the road saw her first and stopped talking, and the men next to them turned to see what they were looking at, and it rippled outward until there were 80 grown men standing in a gravel parking lot in silence, watching a 115-pound girl in a thin jacket walk toward them holding a piece of cardboard. Then somebody laughed. It wasn't cruel, exactly. That's almost worse. It was the laugh you give when something is so far outside the shape of your day that laughing is the only available response. A big man near the bar door read the sign out loud so his friends could hear it, and one of them said something about the diner up the road and told her they were about to head out. Honey, and she'd have better luck with the breakfast crowd. And another man, and he has never forgiven himself for this, and he has said so, publicly, to people who told me, Another man looked at the charcoal on her hands and the tape on her sketchbook, and he asked her, with a grin, whether she had ever even drawn a motorcycle before. She didn't answer him right away. She had stopped walking about 15 feet inside the lot, and she was looking past all of them, at the middle, at the black Harley sitting on the gravel, with 80 bikes arranged around it like a fence. And she said, "I drew that one hundreds of times." Nobody laughed at that. They didn't understand it, but nobody laughed. And then she said the second part, and she said it quietly, almost to herself, the way you'd say something you'd been carrying for a while and had finally set down. I just never saw it finished. 80 men, nobody breathing. Somewhere behind the bar, a screen door came loose from somebody's hand and slapped shut against its frame, and that was the loudest sound in that parking lot. 79 of those men heard a stranger say something strange. 79 of them stood there with a cold feeling climbing up the back of their necks, trying to make the sentence mean something, and failing, and looking at each other to see if anyone else had it. One man didn't have to work it out. One man in that lot heard those 7 words and knew exactly what they meant, and exactly who was standing on that gravel, and exactly what it was going to cost him. And while 79 men were staring at a girl with a cardboard sign, he was already reaching into his pocket for his keys. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something, because it is going to matter in about 20 minutes. There is a man standing in that parking lot right now who knows exactly who this girl is. He knows why her clothes don't fit. He knows why she's been sleeping in a car. He knows why her mother is dead. He knows all of it, because he is the reason. And in a little while, he is going to stand up in front of 80 men who used to call him brother, and he is going to look a starving 24-year-old in the face, and he is going to call her a liar, not because he believes it, but because it is the only thing left between him and the truth. If you believe a man like that should never get away with it, hit subscribe right now. I mean it. Because men like him are counting on nobody paying attention. That is the entire business model. That is how he got 5 years. And type "I see you, Duke" in the comments, so he knows we're watching. Now let me tell you about Stone. Ronan Mercer is 58 years old, and the road name he's had since he was 23 is Stone. And it did not start out as a compliment. It started because he doesn't move his face. Doesn't matter what you tell him. Doesn't matter what he's looking at. Some men are hard the way a fist is hard, and some men are hard the way a wall is hard. And Stone is the second kind. He is the president of the Iron Saints. He has been for 5 years, which tells you exactly how long he has been doing a job he never asked for. Before that, he was Caleb Halloway's road captain. He rode on Caleb's right hand for 11 years. He was the best man at his wedding, and he was the one who drove out to the county line at 4 in the morning when the call came, and he was the one they let into the room, and he was the one who said yes, that's him. And there is one more thing about Ronan Mercer, and it is the reason this story exists. Inside his cut, sewn into the lining on the left-hand side over the ribs, there is a pocket. And in that pocket, for 5 years, there has been a sealed envelope. It's not in good shape anymore. 5 years of a man's body heat and a man's sweat and 100,000 miles of wind will do that to paper. The corners are soft as cloth. There's a crease down the middle that has been folded and unfolded so many times it's nearly worn through. It is addressed in Caleb Halloway's handwriting. One word on the front, Wren. He wrote it the week before he died. He gave it to Stone the way men like that do. No ceremony, no explanation, just handed it across a workbench and said if anything happens, make sure she gets this, and then changed the subject. Stone never delivered it. Not because he didn't try. 4 months after the funeral, he drove out to the house with that envelope in his pocket and a check from the club in his hand. And he pulled up in the driveway, and the windows were dark, and there was a foreclosure notice taped to the front door, and the mailbox was full of mail addressed to a family that wasn't there anymore. No forwarding address, phone disconnected, gone. He looked. Understand that. He looked every single year. He asked people. He made calls. And every year, when he came up empty again, He came to the same conclusion. The only conclusion a man like Stone could come to with the information he had. She doesn't want to be found. She wants nothing to do with us. So here is where we actually are, standing in that gravel lot on the third Saturday in October. She spent 5 years believing they abandoned her. He spent 5 years believing she abandoned them. And the only man alive who knew the truth was standing right there between them, saying nothing. The first man to say yes was 71 years old, and he only said yes because he wanted to watch her fail. His name is Odell Krantz, but nobody in that club has called him Odell since the Reagan administration. They call him Preacher, and the story of how he got that name is not a nice one and is not mine to tell. What matters is that he has been riding with the Iron Saints for 26 years. He is the oldest man in the club, and on that particular Saturday morning, he was standing near the fence line with his arms crossed, looking at a girl with a cardboard sign, and feeling something he could not have named if you'd offered him money. Because 79 men were standing in that lot trying to work out what she'd meant about the black Harley, and the silence had gone on long enough that it was starting to curdle into something else. Into embarrassment, into the specific unbearable discomfort that grown men feel when something honest happens in front of them and nobody knows what to do about it. And Preacher, who had been getting rooms out of awkward silences for 50 years, did the thing that came naturally. He pointed at his own motorcycle and he said, "Loud enough for everybody. All right, draw mine." It was not kindness. I want to be honest about that, because he has been honest about it. He said it as a joke. He said it because he wanted to break the tension, and because he figured the fastest way to end whatever was happening in that parking lot was to let the girl take her swing and miss. 71 years old. He has seen a lot of people promise a lot of things. So she walked over, and she stood in front of his bike, a 1996 Road King, blue under 29 years of road grime, with a dent in the left saddlebag he has never fixed, and she looked at it for maybe 20 seconds, and then she turned around and asked him a question. "Not about the bike," she said. "How long were you married?" He has told people since that he does not know how she knew, and I've thought about it a long time, and I don't think it's complicated. There was a ring on that man's hand, worn thin, and there was a second ring on a chain around his neck, and it was out over his shirt, not tucked in, because he had stopped bothering to tuck it in. That's all. She looked at a man's hands, and she looked at his throat, and she asked him the only question in the world worth asking him. He didn't answer for a while, long enough that the men nearest him started looking at the ground. Then he said, 41 years. And then he said, "She's been gone since March." She nodded once. She didn't say sorry. That's the part every man in that lot has mentioned since. That she did not say she was sorry, and did not tilt her head, and did not do the thing that people do. She just nodded, like a carpenter taking a measurement. Then she sat down on the gravel and she opened the sketchbook and she started to draw. It took 9 minutes. Understand what 9 minutes is in a parking lot with 80 men in it. It is a long time. It is long enough for people to get bored and drift back to their conversations, and for a couple of them to do exactly that, and for the men closest to her to slowly stop talking altogether. Because from 4 feet away you could see what was appearing on that page, and it was not what any of them had been expecting. She was not tracing a shape. She was building an object. The spokes went in one at a time. The lettering on the tank went in freehand, and it was right. The specific worn-down way the gold leaf had faded on the left side and not the right, because that's the side that catches the sun when you ride west, and he rides west, because he always has. And she spent almost 2 full minutes on nothing but the fuel tank. Then she stood up, and she brushed the gravel off the back of her jeans, and she turned the sketchbook around. Preacher looked at it. Now, at first, and I have been told this by 3 different men who were standing there, at first, he just made a sound. Not a word. Just air. Because the drawing was extraordinary, and even a man who came to watch a stranger fail can recognize a thing that is extraordinary. And then he leaned in closer, the way you lean in when your eye has caught something your brain hasn't finished with yet. Because in the curve of that fuel tank, where the chrome bends and the world bends with it, there was a reflection. There were the shapes you'd expect. The distorted stretch of the gravel lot, the blur of other bikes, the line of the fence. And standing in that reflection, just at the edge, half in and half out of frame, the way a person looks when they're reflected in something curved and they're standing slightly behind you and slightly to the side, was a woman. She wasn't drawn on the tank. That's the part I need you to understand, because it's the difference between a nice gesture and what actually happened. She wasn't a decal or a ghost or a face floating in the paint. She was drawn in the reflection. Which means, in the logic of that drawing, in the physics of that piece of chrome, she was not on the motorcycle. She was standing next to it. She was standing just off the edge of the picture, out of the frame, in the place where somebody stands when they're waiting for you to get on the bike so they can climb on behind you. Preacher did not say anything. He took the sketchbook out of her hands, took it, gently, but took it, and he held it. And he looked at it for maybe 15 seconds, and then he handed it back, and he turned around, and he walked across that gravel lot to the fence line at the far end. And he stood there, with his back to 80 men for 4 minutes. Nobody followed him. Nobody said his name. 80 men stood in a parking lot and gave a 71-year-old man 4 minutes of privacy in the middle of an open field, which is the only privacy a place like that has to offer, and which they gave without being asked. Now, I want to be careful how I say this next part, because I know how it sounds, and I know what it starts to sound like if you're not careful, and I have no interest in telling you a story about magic. I don't think that girl was doing magic. I think she was doing something rarer than that. Odell Krantz buried his wife of 41 years in March. It was October. That's 7 months. And in 7 months, that man had been to the grocery store, and to the doctor, and to church, and to that bar, and to 2 other funerals, and he had spoken to hundreds of people, and every single one of them had said the same 6 words to him, which are, "I'm so sorry for your loss," and then changed the subject as fast as they possibly could. Because that's what we do. We're afraid of it. We say the sentence that closes the door, and we call it respect, and what it actually is fear. Nobody asked him about her. 7 months, and nobody asked him a single question about the woman he had spent 41 years of his life beside. Not what she was like. Not how they met. Not how long. Nothing. Because asking might upset him. And God forbid we upset him. God forbid a widower should have to think about his wife. And a 24-year-old girl, who had not eaten in 2 days, sat down on the gravel and asked him how long, and he said 41 years, and she put her in the drawing. That's not magic. That's just paying attention. And the reason it landed on that man like a truck is that nobody had done it in 7 months. Word does not travel fast in a place like that. It travels instantly. By the time Preacher came back from the fence line, and he came back, and his face was exactly as still as it always is, and he did not mention it, and no man in that club has ever mentioned it to him since. There were already 6 men standing in a loose line, and the line was getting longer, and somebody had brought her a folding chair from inside the bar. The second man was Bishop Ardeen. I need to tell you something about Bishop, and I need to tell you why it's going to sound like almost nothing. He doesn't talk about it. That's the whole thing. That's the entire biography. He served, and he came back, and he does not talk about it. Not with his wife. Not with the club. Not on the anniversary. Not on Veterans Day. Not at 3 in the morning with a bottle in his hand, which is when most men finally crack. And he doesn't. 22 years of riding with those men, and there is not one of them who could tell you the name of a single person Bishop Ardeen served with. He sat down in front of her, and he said, "Do the bike. Don't do anything clever." She said, "Okay." And then, because she is who she is, she asked him a question anyway. 1. She said, "How many did you bring home?" and there was a silence that men in that lot have described to me as the longest of the entire day, longer than the one at the end. And Bishop Ardeen looked at the gravel between his boots, and he said 2 words, "Not 11. That's it. That is the whole conversation. That is more than he had said about it in 22 years. And he said it to a homeless stranger with charcoal under her fingernails. And then he shut his mouth, and he did not open it again. She drew for 11 minutes, and what she gave him when she turned it around was his motorcycle, and out of the pipes, the exhaust, curling up and back the way it does when you're idling in cold air, and she'd drawn the smoke going up and thinning and breaking apart against nothing. And in the smoke, in the negative space, in the places where the charcoal had been lifted rather than laid down, were 11 names. She did not know the names. She could not have. He never said them. He has never said them out loud to a living soul. She had drawn 11 spaces where names go. You have to tilt the paper. You have to hold it up and turn it toward the light and let the grain of the charcoal catch. And then they're there. And they're not really letters at all. They're the shape of names. The way a name looks from across a room when you can't read it, but you know that's what it is. 11 of them. Bishop Ardeen took that drawing and he folded it once, carefully, and put it inside his jacket, and he stood up, and he shook that girl's hand, and he is a man who does not touch people, and he said, and then he walked away, and he did not say another word for the rest of the morning. The third one broke the spell, and thank God for it, because by that point the men in that lot were about 4 minutes away from something none of them had the vocabulary for. Nathaniel Sable. They call him Rook. He's 31, which makes him a child in that company, and he had his 4-year-old daughter's car seat strapped in the back of a truck parked at the edge of the lot because his wife had dropped him off. 2 years ago, that little girl had put her hand flat on the side panel of his bike. Both of them had been in the garage. His hands were covered in grease. Hers, somehow, were covered in more. And she put her whole palm on that clean painted panel and left a perfect 4-year-old handprint in black grease right in the middle of it. He never washed it off. He washes that motorcycle every week of his life. He wipes around it. He has been mocked for this by every man in the Iron Saints, and about a year ago he stopped explaining himself, and now he just wipes around it. Wren drew the handprint, but that's not what got him. What got her, and what got him, is that she drew it glowing. Every other surface on that motorcycle in her drawing is dark, the panels shaded, the chrome cold, the whole machine sitting in shadow. And that one greasy handprint, that filthy little smear of a 4-year-old's palm on the side of a Harley Davidson, is drawn as though it is the only source of light in the entire world. The shadows fall away from it. The chrome catches it. It lights the underside of the fender. Rook laughed. He laughed out loud, hard, and he held it up and showed the men behind him, and he was grinning like an idiot. And then, about 4 seconds later, he stopped laughing, and he did not hand that drawing to anyone else. That's when the money started. It was not a trickle. Somebody put a 20 in the coffee cup she'd set down beside her, and then somebody put in 2 20s, and then a man walked past without breaking stride and dropped a 50 in and didn't even look at her, because looking at her would have meant a conversation, and he did not trust his voice. And then a man put a $100 bill in that cup. He didn't say anything. He didn't wait for a drawing. He hadn't asked for one. He put $100 in a paper coffee cup belonging to a girl he had met 40 minutes earlier, and he walked back to his motorcycle and sat down on it and stared at the highway. She tried to give change. I want you to hear that. She tried to give people their change. She stood up with a fistful of 20s, and she went after a man who had overpaid and tried to hand him back $60, and he put his hands in his pockets like a child refusing to take medicine, and he walked away from her. Nobody took the change. Not one man in that lot took the change. By 11 o'clock that morning, Wren Halloway, who had woken up in a 1997 sedan with $6.40 to her name and 11 blank pages left, had more money in a paper cup than she had made in the previous 3 months of her life. 14 bikes, 14 drawings. And here is the thing that nobody noticed, and that I want you to notice, because it is going to come back, and it is going to matter more than anything else in this story. 14 times, a man pointed at the middle of that parking lot. 14 times, somebody said some version of "Do the Black One." It became a joke. It became the running joke of the morning, because that was the best bike in the lot, and it was the one they all worshipped, and of course that's the one you'd want on paper. And 14 times, she said the same 3 words. Not that one. Not "I can't." Not "maybe later." Not "I don't do that kind." Not that one. She said it 14 times, in the same flat voice, without ever looking up from what she was working on. And not one of those 80 men asked her why. They should have. Right now, in that parking lot, everything is going right. And that is exactly why I need you to brace yourself, because there is a man standing at the edge of that lot, near the trucks, where the shade is, and he has been watching this for 2 hours. He has watched 80 of his former brothers open their wallets for a girl he was certain he had erased from the earth. He has watched her make more money in one morning than she has seen in a year. He has watched the men in that club start looking at her the way you look at family. And somewhere in the last 20 minutes, he has done the arithmetic. Because if she stays another hour, somebody is going to ask her a question he cannot survive. So he is going to do the only thing that men like him have ever done, in the entire history of men like him. He is going to hurt her first. If you have ever had somebody lie about you to save themselves, comment, "She's telling the truth." Right now. Let's get it on the record before he opens his mouth. His name is Duke Van Trell. He was the treasurer of the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club for 9 years. His patch was pulled 3 years ago over what the club minutes, in a beautiful piece of understatement, referred to as bookkeeping irregularities, which is the phrase you use when everybody knows and nobody can prove it. He was not thrown out. There was no vote. He was simply asked to hand in his colors, and he did. And he still comes to the memorial ride every single year because it is open to anyone who rode with Caleb. Nobody wanted him there. Nobody could tell him not to come. And he chose his moment beautifully. I have to give him that. He waited until the 14th drawing was finished, and the crowd was thick, and the money in that cup was visible from 20 feet away, and then he walked out of the shade and into the middle of that parking lot, and he did not shout, and that is what made it work. He was reasonable. He said, "And men who were there have given me this almost word for word. Boys, I'm going to say the thing nobody wants to say." And then he turned and looked at her, and he said, "You didn't find this ride by accident." He let that sit. There are 100 bars on this highway. There are 4,000 parking lots between here and the state line, and you walked into this one, on this Saturday, in this month, with a sign. And a couple of the men shifted, and I want you to feel that, because that is the sound of a lie getting traction. You knew what today was. You knew what that bike in the middle of this lot was. You said so yourself, out loud, in front of every man standing here. You looked at it before you looked at any of us. And then he said it. You came here to squeeze 80 grieving men for cash off a dead man's name. And then he said the word. He said it slowly, and he said it clearly, and he said it so that every man in that gravel lot could hear all 3 syllables. Isn't that right, Halloway? Half that lot turned, not toward Duke, toward her, because up until that second, she was a girl with a sketchbook, and now she was a name, and it was the name on a headstone 90 minutes east of that parking lot, the one where the word brother is carved bigger than the word father, and there is not a man in the Iron Saints who does not know that name the way he knows his own. And here is the cruelest part of the whole thing, the part that makes me sick every time I think about it. She couldn't prove he was wrong. Look at what he said. Take it apart, line by line, and try to find the lie. She did come to that specific lot. That's true. She did look at that specific motorcycle before she looked at any of them. 80 men watched her do it. She was taking their money. It was sitting in a paper cup on the gravel, in plain view, several $1,000s of it. She is Caleb Halloway's daughter, and she had been standing in that parking lot for 2.5 hours, and she had not told them. Every single fact was true. Somebody in the back said, "Is that right? Is that his kid?" And she opened her mouth, and nothing came out, because what do you say? Yes, but. And the moment you say yes, but, you have already lost, and some part of her knew that, and I think some part of her had known it her entire life. The cup stopped filling. A man came forward and took his drawing back off the pile. Just reached down and took it and walked away with it and would not look at her. And Wren Halloway got down on her knees on the gravel and started putting her charcoals back in the tin. Now, I want you to notice how he did that. Go back and look at it, because you will see this trick again in your life, and I want you to know it when it happens. He didn't lie, not once, not one single time. He took 11 true things and he stacked them into a shape that looked like a crime. That's not an argument. That's not evidence. That is a magic trick, and it works on good people every single time, because good people believe that facts add up to the truth, and they don't. They never have. Facts are bricks. You can build a house out of them, or you can build a wall around an innocent person, and the bricks don't care which one you're doing. 80 of the toughest men in that county stood there and watched a starving girl pack up her charcoal, and not one of them stopped her. That's how good the trick is. She didn't defend herself. That's what nobody was ready for. She had every reason to scream, and she didn't. And I think it is because she had already been screaming for 5 years and nobody had heard it. And at some point you just stop. She stood up with the tin in her hands and she looked at the men in front of her and she said it flat. No tears, no shake in the voice, like a woman reading a list of groceries off the back of an envelope. She said, "My mother's name was Delphine." She said, "She got sick 8 months after the funeral." She said the medical debt took the house in the 3rd year. We moved into an apartment and then a smaller one, and then we didn't. She said she died in the 4th year, in a hospice bed, in February. And then she said, "I wrote to you once." And that landed in that parking lot like a stone through a windshield. I was 19 years old. My mother was dying and I could not pay for the bed she was dying in. And I sat down and I wrote a letter to my father's club, and I asked for help. One letter. I only ever sent one, and nobody answered. And then she looked at Ronan Mercer, straight at him, past 80 men, right down the middle of that lot. And she said the sentence that men who were standing there tell me they still hear when they can't sleep. You buried him, and then you buried us. Now you have to understand what was happening on Stone's face. Because that man has a face that does not do anything. That is his entire reputation. He identified his best friend's body in a county morgue at 4 a.m, and the deputy who was with him has said publicly that Stone Mercer did not change expression, not once, not for a second. And 80 men watched him standing in that gravel lot, and they watched something come apart behind his eyes, because he did not know what she was talking about. He genuinely, physically, did not understand the sentence that had just been spoken to him. He had spent 5 years looking for a girl who he believed had walked away from her father's brothers and never looked back. And she had just told him that she had reached out to him, once, at 19, from beside her mother's deathbed. And Ronan Mercer had never seen a letter. He took one step toward her, and his voice, when it came out, did not sound like his voice. He said, "Who did you send it to?" And she said it like it was obvious, like it was the stupidest question anyone had ever asked her, because to her, it was the club address, the P.O. box, whoever picks up the mail. And every man in that parking lot, all 80 of them, every single one, at the same time, like a field of wheat going over in a wind, turned and looked at the same person. Because 5 years ago, there was exactly one man in the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club who had a key to that post office box. There was exactly one man who picked up the mail. 79 men in that lot had heard a stranger say something strange this morning. One man heard a ghost, and he was already reaching for his keys. 5 years. 5 years that girl slept in a car and ate out of gas stations, believing that 80 men who had called her father brother had looked at a 19-year-old begging for help and decided she wasn't worth a stamp. 5 years Ronan Mercer rode 100,000 miles with a letter sewn into his jacket, looking for a girl he had convinced himself despised him. 5 years of two people grieving the same man in two different silences. And one man, sat in the middle of that silence and let it happen. Not because he hated her. He didn't even hate her. It was so much smaller than that. He let a 19-year-old girl watch her mother die in debt because her letter was a receipt. And receipts are dangerous to a man who has been stealing from a memorial fund. If you cannot stand a man who steals from the dead, comment "no more lies" right now. Before we go one step further, and if you believe Wren Halloway deserves to know who her father actually was, subscribe. Because Duke Vantrell spent 5 years of his life making certain that she never would, and I would very much like him to see exactly how many people showed up on her side of that parking lot. Now stay with me, because in about 40 seconds, that girl is going to stop packing. She is going to stand up in the middle of 80 men, and she is going to look at the one motorcycle she has refused to touch 14 times, and she is going to ask them for 10 minutes. And what she does with those 10 minutes is the reason I made this video. Duke Vantrell started shouting. That's what men like him do when the floor goes out from under them. They get loud, because loud has always worked before, and it takes a while to understand that it has stopped working. He was saying that this was a setup. He was saying that she'd been coached. He was saying somebody had put her up to this, and he was pointing at Stone while he said it, and his voice had climbed about half an octave and cracked twice. And the lot was moving. Not fast. That's what people don't understand about that kind of moment. It doesn't happen fast. Men just start walking. 3 of them, then 6, then more, closing the distance from the outside in. Boots crunching over gravel, no shouting on their end at all. And that silence coming toward him was worse than any noise Duke could have made. Somebody said, "Don't." Somebody else said, "Not here." It was going to happen anyway. Anyone who has ever stood in a place like that knows it was going to happen anyway. And it was going to happen in about 11 seconds. And there were 80 men and one of him, and the nearest sheriff's deputy was 40 minutes down Highway 62. And Wren Halloway stopped all of it, not by shouting. She didn't say a word. She walked into the middle of that parking lot, walked right through the men who were moving, and they parted for her without knowing why, and she went to the black Harley in the center of the lot, and she turned around, and she sat down on the gravel in front of it, cross-legged, sketchbook on her knees, and the entire lot stopped. 80 men, mid-stride, stopped, because a girl had sat down. She opened the book to the last page, 11 blank pages she'd had that morning. 14 drawings later, she was down to one, the last one. She turned the cover back and flattened it with her palm, and she looked up at Ronan Mercer, and she said, "Give me 10 minutes." And then she said, "Then I'll go." And Stone Mercer, president of the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club, a man who had not asked anyone's permission for anything in 30 years, stood in that parking lot and took his hat off. That was all. He just took his hat off. And 80 men understood exactly what that meant, and they formed a circle. Not a huddle, a circle, a wide one, 5 or 6 deep in places, all the way around her and the motorcycle, the way men stand around a fire. Somebody went inside the bar and killed the jukebox, and you could hear the plug come out of the wall, and then the only sound in the world was the highway, and the wind moving through the gravel, and the sound of a piece of charcoal on paper. She drew for a long time. She started at the front wheel. She always did. Every drawing she'd made that morning, she'd started at the front wheel, the way you'd start a letter with the date. The spoke, then the next spoke, then the next, the rhythm of it, her wrist barely moving, her whole arm working from the shoulder. Her hair kept falling forward and she kept pushing it back with the side of her wrist because her fingers were black, and it left a smear of charcoal across her temple that stayed there for the rest of the day and that nobody told her about because nobody wanted to interrupt. 20 minutes went by. She had said 10. Nobody said anything about it. The sun came around the side of the bar and dropped low over the fence line and turned the whole parking lot the color of an old photograph. And the light came in flat and hard across the gravel, and she kept drawing. She was building the front forks, then the headlamp housing. Then she spent 9 full minutes on the chrome of the engine. And men who were standing 5 feet from her watched a motorcycle appear on a blank page, the way you'd watch something rise up out of deep water. And then she got to the tank, and this is where you need to understand something that not one man in that circle understood yet. Because there is a place on that motorcycle, I told you at the start that there was. One specific place where the metal was bare, unpainted. 5 years, that bike had sat in a garage bay under a canvas sheet, finished in every particular except one. And every man in the Iron Saints had looked at that empty space and thought the same thing. He just never got around to it. They were wrong. Caleb Halloway designed that motorcycle when his daughter was 11 years old. He had the whole thing drawn out on graph paper. The tank, the fender, the pipes, every line of it. And he had it worked out down to the last bolt. And he left one panel empty on the drawing. He put a box around it, and he wrote 2 words inside the box. And when he built the bike, he left that panel bare. He wrote it that way for 4 years and told everyone he hadn't decided yet. He had decided when she was 11. He had decided the day he drew it. He was waiting until she was good enough to paint it herself. 2 words in the box on the graph paper. Wren's panel. Nobody knew that. Nobody living knew that except one person. And she was sitting cross-legged on the gravel in front of it, drawing her father's motorcycle onto the last blank page she owned. And she was crying, and she was not making any noise about it at all, and her hand never stopped. 80 men watched her fill in the empty space. She closed the book. She sat there for a second with her hand flat on the cover, breathing, and then she got up off the gravel, and her legs had gone, and Preacher put a hand under her elbow, and she let him. And she turned the sketchbook around. At first, it just looked like the bike. That's the thing. That's what everybody says. For about 4 seconds, it was simply a photograph of a motorcycle drawn in charcoal. The chrome, the black tank, the forks. So exact that a man in the 3rd row said out loud, "That's it. That's the bike." And then somebody near the front made a sound. Because he'd looked at the windshield. There were people in the windshield. 4 of them. A man, a woman, and 2 children, one small enough to be carried. And they were not floating there. They were reflected there, standing behind the viewer. And behind them was smoke. The family from the car. 5 years ago, on a state road outside a town none of them had ever heard of, Caleb Halloway got a family of 4 out of a burning vehicle and went back for a 5th person who, it turned out, had never been in the car at all. The roof came down. That's the whole story. That's how he died. 4 people are alive today, and none of them were ever able to explain to anyone why he went back in. And she'd put them in the glass, alive, watching. Then a man said, "Look at the mirror." In the left mirror, small, no bigger than a thumbnail, there was a woman. She was maybe 26 years old. Her head was tipped back. She was laughing, really laughing, mouth open, eyes shut. And she was laughing at something just out of frame. Preacher said her name out loud before he could stop himself. Because every man in that club who had been there long enough knew that face. Delphine Halloway at 26, on the back of that man's first bike, laughing the way she used to laugh before the world got its hands on her. And then they looked at the tank, and on the black curve of the fuel tank, sitting sideways with her ankles crossed, was a little girl. 6, maybe 7, not posed, just sitting there the way a kid sits on a bike in a garage while her father works. And behind her, reaching around her, big hands closed over the grips on either side of her, was Caleb. You couldn't see his face. She hadn't drawn his face. She'd drawn the arms and the shoulders and the shape of a man leaning forward around a child, which is what she remembered, because that is what you remember when you are 6 years old and your father is standing behind you. And then somebody looked at the background. And that's when the parking lot ended, because behind the motorcycle, in the shadows, in the dark charcoal that she had laid down so heavy it went almost black, there were men, dozens of them, standing, shoulder to shoulder, in a line, filling the whole width of the page behind that bike. And not one of them looked like an outlaw. Not one of them looked frightening or dangerous or like anything you have ever been taught to see when you look at a man in a leather vest on the side of a highway. They looked like a wall. They looked like a fence, built out of men, standing between a little girl and everything in the world that could ever come for her. And along the bottom of the page, in charcoal, in her own hand, she had written, "A man dies twice, once when his heart stops, and again when his brothers stop telling his story." Nobody spoke. Odell Krantz, 71 years old, 41 years married, buried his wife in March, has not cried in front of another human being since 1974, sat down on the gravel of that parking lot like his knees had simply been taken away from him, and put his face in his hands and wept. And then Bishop Ardeen, who does not talk about it. And then Rook. And then a man in the back. And then two more. And then a sound went through that lot that I do not know how to describe to you, except to say that 80 men were making it, and none of them were trying to stop. And Ronan Mercer, who did not change expression in a county morgue at 4 in the morning, stood in the middle of a gravel parking lot on Highway 62 with his hat in his hand, and his face came apart. 80 of them. I have been told by 3 different men who were standing in that lot that for almost a full minute, the only sound they could hear was the highway. Just cars going by, people driving to dinner, not knowing. Stone got down on one knee on the gravel in front of her. He reached inside his cut, into the pocket sewn into the lining over the ribs, and he took out the envelope. 5 years of a man's body heat, 5 years of sweat and wind, and 100,000 miles. The corners had gone soft as cloth. The crease down the middle had been folded and unfolded so many times the paper had worn nearly through, and you could see daylight in it. One word on the front, in her father's handwriting. Wren. He laid it on the pavement beside the drawing. He didn't hand it to her. He laid it down, the way you lay something down at a grave. And he said, "He wrote this the week before. I've carried it every day since I couldn't find you." She opened it there, on her knees, in front of 80 men, and I'm not going to read you all of it, because it isn't mine, and it isn't yours either. But I'll give you the part she read out loud, because she chose to read it out loud, and she read it in a voice that broke on the second line and did not stop. "Wren, if you're reading this, then I broke my promise, and I'm sorry. I know what you think this bike is. It isn't. You were never the thing I built around the family. You were the family I built everything else around. Every man who hands you this letter already swore he'd stand where I can't. Make them keep it." And then Ronan Mercer looked at the top of that letter, and he stopped breathing. Because Caleb Halloway wrote the date. He wrote the date on everything, all his life, because he was a foundry man, and that's what you do. And that date was 11 days after the club voted in its treasurer, which meant the ledgers existed, which meant they were signed, which meant there was a book in a filing cabinet in the back office of a clubhouse 90 minutes east. And Ronan Mercer knew exactly which one, and exactly which page, and exactly whose name was at the bottom of it. He stood up, and Duke Vantrell ran. He got about 30 feet. He did not make it to his truck. He did not make it out of that lot, and I will leave it there, because what happened in the next 4 seconds is not the point of this story, and I refuse to let him have it. They opened the books that night. $41,000. Out of the memorial fund, the fund that 80 men had put money into every single month, for one reason, which was written into the club's own bylaws in Caleb's handwriting, for the families. $41,000, over 3 years, in amounts small enough that nobody would look twice. And in the bottom of a box in Duke Vantrell's garage, they found her letter. He kept it. He kept it. Because men like him always keep the receipt. Because somewhere in whatever passes for a soul in a man like that, he needed the proof that he had been the one holding the knife. 19 years old. Handwritten, asking for help with a hospice bill. They pulled the last of his colors, the club insignia, off the back of a jacket he was never entitled to wear again. And then they did something worse than anything they could have done to him with their hands. They gave every page of it to the county sheriff. And then 80 men turned their backs on him, all at once, and walked away, and left Duke Vantrell standing alone in the middle of a gravel parking lot on Highway 62, with nobody to talk to. 80 men, and not one of them would look at him. Remember that name you typed in the comments an hour ago? He's finally hearing it. Stone offered her the money. All of it. Every dollar they recovered, and more besides. The club voted it that night, unanimous, no discussion. And she said no. She said, "That's not what I came for." And then she said quieter, "I didn't even know I came for anything." And then she asked them for the only thing she wanted. And it is the sentence this entire story has been walking toward, from the moment she stepped onto that gravel with a piece of her mother's medicine box in her hands. She said, "Tell me who my father was when he wasn't being my father." The memorial ride never happened that year. 80 motorcycles sat cold in a parking lot outside a bar on Highway 62, and 80 men sat down on the gravel around a 24-year-old woman, and they told her about him until 2 o'clock in the morning. Some of it was heroic. A lot of it wasn't. There is a story involving a stolen goat and a wedding reception that took 4 men to tell because none of them could get through it alone. Preacher told 4. Rook told 1 about a flat tire in a rainstorm that made no sense at all and that everybody laughed at anyway. And Bishop Ardeen, who does not talk about it, who had not said 11 words to another human being that entire day, told exactly one story. It took him 20 minutes to get through it. Nobody rushed him, and she drew the whole time. On napkins, on the backs of receipts, on cardboard, on anything anybody could find, because she had run out of pages, and men were pulling paper out of their saddlebags and handing it to her like they were feeding a fire. The Iron Saints cleared out the storage room above the club garage. They did it in a weekend. It has a north-facing window, which is the best light in the building, and one of them knew that because his daughter went to art school. She calls it Last Ride Portraits. She draws motorcycles for the families of men who don't come home. Widows send her photographs. Sons send her paint codes. There is a waiting list now, and it is long, and she has never once turned down a family who couldn't pay. The following October, the memorial ride went ahead. The black Harley wasn't trailered in that year. It was ridden. Ronan Mercer rode it, and Wren Halloway rode behind him, and the empty panel on that motorcycle wasn't empty anymore, because a girl who had been waiting since she was 11 years old finally painted it herself. 80 motorcycles behind her, all the way down Highway 62, and tucked under the clear cover on the fuel tank, sealed against the weather, was a drawing on the last page of a taped-up sketchbook, the one that silenced 80 men in a parking lot outside a bar. Duke Vantrell got 18 months, and a restitution order he will be paying until he is 70 years old. But here's the part I want to stay with you. He almost won. He almost got away with it, forever. Another hour and she would have driven away, and she would have gone on believing that her father's brothers looked at her and turned their backs. And 80 men would have gone on believing that Caleb Halloway's daughter hated them, and every single one of them would have died believing it. And the only reason that didn't happen is that a starving girl walked into a parking lot and asked 80 strangers if she could draw their motorcycles for tips. If you believe people like Wren deserve better than the world gave her, subscribe. If you believe people like Duke deserve exactly what they got, hit that like button. And do me one favor. Share this with somebody who has decided that men in leather are men without hearts, because 80 of them sat on gravel until 2 in the morning to make sure a stranger knew who her father was. Tell me in the comments, what would you have said to her? I read every one,